Tupac was about to walk onto the stage when an old janitor stopped him with 6 words that changed everything. What happened in those final 20 minutes backstage would transform one of hip-hop's greatest performances and reveal a secret that had been hidden for 30 years. It was March 18th, 1996, at Chicago's United Center, and Tupac Shakur was preparing for what many would later call the most emotionally charged performance of his career. The arena was packed with 23,000 screaming fans, and the energy was electric. But nobody in that crowd knew that in exactly 23 minutes, they would witness something unprecedented. But what they didn't know was that Tupac was struggling. Tupac had been having one of those days where everything felt heavy. The legal troubles were mounting. The East Coast-West Coast beef was escalating to dangerous levels, and the constant pressure of being seen as either a hero or a villain was exhausting him. As he sat in his dressing room, staring at himself in the mirror, he felt disconnected from the passion that usually drove his performances. The face in the mirror looked tired, not just physically, but soul-tired. The exhaustion sleep couldn't fix, that success couldn't cure. He'd been going through the motions lately, performing because he had to, not because he felt the fire. Maybe I'm losing myself, he thought. Maybe all this controversy is making me forget why I started. He'd gone through his usual pre-show routine, vocal warm-ups, reviewing the set list, getting his head right. But tonight felt different. Tonight, he felt disconnected, going through motions rather than feeling the passion that drove his performances. His crew was bustling outside, making final preparations. Through the walls, he could hear the crowd's distant roar, but instead of exciting him, it felt like pressure. "Pac, you ready?" called out Big Frank, one of his security guards, from outside the dressing room door. 25 minutes to showtime. Sound check went perfectly. Crowds hyped. Tupac nodded, even though Frank couldn't see him. "Yeah, I'm ready," he replied, though he wasn't sure if it was true. He stood up from his chair, straightened his white tank top, and decided to take a walk through the backstage areas to clear his head. Sometimes moving around, seeing the behind-the-scenes operation that made his shows possible, helped him reconnect with the collaborative energy that made performing meaningful. The backstage area of the United Center was a maze of concrete corridors, equipment cases, and busy crew members preparing for the show. Tupac walked slowly through this controlled chaos, acknowledging staff with nods and brief conversations. Usually, connecting with the crew helped ground him, but tonight even these interactions felt hollow. As he turned a corner near the loading dock, lost in thought, he nearly bumped into an elderly black man in worn janitorial coveralls who was quietly mopping the floor. The man looked up, startled by the sudden appearance of the famous rapper, and immediately stepped aside with practiced deference. "Sorry about that, sir," the man said respectfully, his voice carrying a slight southern accent mixed with years of Chicago inflection. "Didn't mean to be in your way. Just trying to get these floors clean before the crowd starts moving through here after the show." But what struck Tupac wasn't the man's apology or his explanation, it was his eyes. They were deep brown eyes that had clearly seen things, lived through experiences, carried weight that most people never had to bear. In that instant, Tupac recognized something familiar, something that reminded him of his own struggles with loss and pain. There was dignity in those eyes, but also a kind of quiet sadness that spoke of battles fought and survived, of dreams deferred but not forgotten, of strength maintained through circumstances that would have broken weaker men. "Nah, brother, you're good," Tupac replied, stopping instead of continuing his walk. "I was the one not paying attention. What's your name?" The janitor seemed genuinely surprised that Tupac was not only talking to him, but actually asking his name. In his 15 years working at the United Center, most celebrities barely acknowledged his existence. They saw him as part of the scenery, someone to step around rather than engage with. "William Jenkins, sir," the man replied, still seeming uncertain about why this world-famous rapper was taking time to have a conversation with him. "But most folks around here just call me Bill. How long you been working here, Bill?" Tupac asked, genuinely curious. Something about this man's presence was calming him in a way that all his usual pre-show preparations had failed to do. "About 15 years now," Bill replied. relaxing slightly as he realized this wasn't going to be a brief, dismissive exchange. Started here when I moved up from Mississippi back in '81. Something about the way Bill carried himself, the quiet dignity in his posture, the careful way he chose his words, the respect he showed without seeming subservient, made Tupac want to keep talking. There was a story here, he could sense it. In Mississippi? That's a long way from Chicago. What brought you up here? Bill hesitated for a moment, leaning his mop against the wall and looking around the empty corridor. He seemed to be debating whether to share something personal with this stranger, even though that stranger happened to be one of the most famous people in America. Well, sir, Bill said finally, his voice dropping slightly, I needed a fresh start after I lost my boy. The words hit Tupac like a physical blow. He'd lost friends to violence, dealt with death and loss throughout his life, but something about the deep, quiet pain in Bill's voice when he said, my boy, touched something profound inside him. I'm sorry to hear that, Tupac said sincerely. And Bill could hear in his voice that it wasn't just a polite response. This young man genuinely felt the weight of what he'd just shared. What happened to your son? Bill looked around the corridor again, then seemed to make a decision. For the first time in months, maybe years, someone was asking about Marcus, not out of obligation or politeness, but because they actually wanted to know. He could see genuine concern and interest in Tupac's eyes. My son Marcus was 22 years old, Bill began. He was serving in Desert Storm. Good boy, always wanted to serve his country. He wrote me letters every week talking about coming home. Tupac felt his throat tighten. Desert Storm? Yes, sir. February 1991, his convoy hit an IED. He and 3 other boys didn't make it home. Bill's hands trembled. I got the news on a Tuesday morning. 2 officers came to my door, and I knew before they said a word. The corridor had gone completely quiet except for the distant sounds of stage preparation, roadies shouting instructions, equipment being moved, the constant hum of activity that preceded every concert. But in their small space, Tupac found himself completely absorbed in this man's story, his own pre-show anxiety forgotten entirely. That's when everything fell apart for me, Bill continued, his voice gaining strength as he shared burdens he'd been carrying alone for years. I started drinking too much, couldn't hold down a job, lost my house down in Jackson. My wife Dorothy, she tried to help me, tried to keep me together, but the grief was eating me alive from the inside. I was angry at everybody, the government for sending him over there, God for letting it happen, myself for not protecting him somehow. Why were you angry at yourself? Tupac asked quietly, recognizing the self-blame that he himself struggled with when friends died in street violence. Bill's voice dropped to almost a whisper, because I was the one who encouraged him to enlist. When Marcus turned 18 and told me he wanted to join the army, I was proud. I was a Vietnam veteran myself, served 2 tours, 68 to 70, and I thought military service would make him a man, give him direction and purpose in life. When he was 17 and wanted to enlist early, I was the one who signed the papers giving permission. The weight of that admission hung in the air between them. Tupac could see the decades of guilt and self-recrimination that Bill had been carrying, could understand the way that kind of responsibility could eat away at someone's soul. That's not on you, man, Tupac said firmly, with conviction that surprised Bill. You were supporting your son's dreams, his choice to serve something bigger than himself. Bill looked up at Tupac with surprise and something that might have been the beginning of relief. You really think so? Because for 5 years I've been telling myself that if I hadn't signed those papers, if I told him to wait until he was older, then he would have enlisted 18 instead of 17. And maybe he'd have been in that same convoy a year later, Tupac interrupted. Bill, your boy chose to serve because he believed in something. That came from how you raised him, the values you taught him. That's not something to feel guilty about. That's something to be proud of. For the first time since they'd started talking, Bill smiled. A small, sad smile, but genuine. You know what's funny? Marcus used to listen to your music. Had all your tapes, played them constantly when he was home on leave. Said your songs helped him understand his own anger about the world, helped him process the injustice he saw. This revelation hit Tupac harder than anything else Bill had shared. The idea that his music had somehow connected with this man's son, a young soldier who had died serving his country, made everything feel suddenly more real and important than any chart position or record sale ever had. "Tell me about Marcus," Tupac said, leaning against the wall. "What was he like as a person?" Bill's entire face changed as he began describing his son. The pain was still there, but now it was mixed with pride and love and joy at the memory of who Marcus had been. Smart as a whip, but tough too. He could take apart any car engine and have it running better than new, but he'd also spend hours reading philosophy books, trying to understand why there was so much injustice and pain. Sounds like he was asking the same questions I ask in my music. That's exactly what he used to tell me. He'd play Brenda's Got a Baby or Keep Your Head Up and say, "Dad, this man understands what we're going through." He's trying to find solutions, trying to wake people up. Tupac felt something fundamental shifting inside him as Bill spoke. This wasn't just idle conversation anymore. This was a connection to something deeper and more meaningful than he'd felt in months, a reminder of why he had started making music in the first place. "Bill, can I ask you something personal?" "Sure, son." "After what I just told you, I think we're past worrying about personal questions. After you lost Marcus, after everything fell apart, what kept you going? What made you want to keep living instead of just giving up completely?" Bill was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Honestly, for about 3 years, nothing did. I was ready to give up completely. I had my daddy's old service pistol, and there were nights when I sat with it in my lap, thinking about joining Marcus wherever he was." The raw honesty of that admission shook Tupac. Here was a man willing to share his deepest, darkest moments with someone he'd just met. "But then I realized something that saved my life." "What was that?" "Marcus didn't die so I could spend the rest of my life being bitter and angry and destroying myself with alcohol. He died believing in something, service, sacrifice, trying to make the world a better place for other people. If I gave up, if I let the pain destroy me, then his sacrifice wouldn't mean anything. I'd be dishonoring everything he stood for." The profound wisdom of that statement hit Tupac like a revelation. Here was a man who had lost the most precious thing in his life, who had every reason to be bitter and angry, but who had somehow found a way to transform that loss into purpose. "So you moved to Chicago and started over?" "That's right. Took me 3 more years to get completely sober, to stop feeling sorry for myself and start living again. But I finally understood that the best way to honor Marcus's memory was to live the kind of life he would have been proud of, honest work, treating people with dignity and respect, trying to be a positive force in the world instead of a destructive one." Tupac looked at this man, this janitor who most people probably walked past without a second thought, and realized he was looking at one of the strongest, most courageous people he'd ever encountered. "Do you ever talk about Marcus with other people?" "Not really," Bill admitted. "Most folks don't want to hear about an old man's grief. They've got their own problems, their own pain to deal with. And I understand that I do not expect the world to stop because I lost my son. But you told me," Bill smiled again, this time with genuine warmth. "You asked. I really asked like you cared about the answer and had time to listen to it. That doesn't happen much in my experience." At that moment, one of Tupac's crew members, a young man with a clipboard and a worried expression, appeared around the corner, walking quickly. "Pac, we really need you," the crew member said urgently. 5 minutes to places. "Sound check's perfect, crowd's getting restless, and the opening act just finished. Chicago PD wants to run through security protocols one more time." Tupac nodded at his crew member, then turned back to Bill. Something had fundamentally changed in his demeanor during their conversation. The disconnection and emptiness he'd been feeling was gone, replaced by a sense of purpose and clarity. "Brother, I need to ask you for a favor." "What's that, son?" "Would you watch the show tonight? Not from back here where you can barely see anything, but from somewhere where you can really experience the whole thing?" Bill looked confused and slightly overwhelmed. "I don't have a ticket, sir. And I'm supposed to be working. My supervisor expects me to have these areas cleaned before the crowd starts moving through. Don't worry about any of that, Tupac said firmly. I'm going to make sure you have the best seat in the house, and I'll square everything with your supervisor personally, because I want you to see something tonight. See what? I want you to see your son's influence. I want you to see how Marcus's spirit, his questions about justice and meaning, live on in this music and in the people who hear it. I want you to understand that his impact on the world didn't end when he died. Bill's eyes filled with tears, the first tears he shed in years that were unborn of pain, but of something that felt almost like hope. I don't understand what you mean. You told me Marcus listened to my music because it helped him understand his anger and process the injustice he saw in the world. Well, tonight, I'm going to perform for him, for you, for every parent who's lost a child serving something bigger than themselves, for everyone who's fighting to find meaning in loss. What happened next would become legendary among Tupac's crew and inner circle. The rapper who had been feeling disconnected and going through the motions suddenly had fire in his eyes again. He looked like he had found his center, his purpose, his reason for being on that stage. Pac, we really need to go, his crew member insisted, glancing nervously at his watch. 2 more minutes, Tupac said, then turned back to Bill with intense focus. I want to tell you something, and I need you to really hear me, to understand what I'm saying. Bill nodded, still overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness and attention this young superstar was showing him. Your son didn't die for nothing. Every song I sing tonight about fighting injustice and standing up for what's right, every word about keeping hope alive when the world tries to crush you, that's Marcus's legacy continuing. You raised a warrior, Bill, and warriors never really die. They live on through the battles they inspire others to fight. Bill broke down completely. Years of suppressed grief and pride and love finally finding release. Tupac put his strong arms around the older man's shoulders and let him cry, not caring about his pre-show schedule or the thousands of people waiting for him. You're going to be watching tonight, Tupac continued, his own voice thick with emotion. And when you see 23,000 people singing about hope, about fighting against impossible odds, about keeping their heads up no matter how hard life gets, I want you to remember that your son is part of that moment. Marcus helped create what you're going to witness. 25 minutes later, Tupac walked onto that Chicago stage with more passion than he'd felt in months. But first, he dedicated the show to Marcus Jenkins, a soldier who died serving his country, and his father, Bill, the strongest man I've ever met. The performance that followed was transcendent. Tupac performed Dear Mama with tears streaming down his face. During Keep Ya Head Up, he looked directly at Bill and saw the older man singing every word, his face glowing with pride. When he performed Me Against the World, Tupac added verses about soldiers fighting for ideals, about fathers carrying loss, about finding strength in memory of those who died too young. But the most powerful moment came during So Many Tears, when Tupac looked out at the audience and spoke directly to Bill. This song goes out to every parent in here who's lost a child. Y'all are the strongest people in the world, and your children's spirits live on through the love and strength you show every day. The entire arena fell silent, then erupted in one of the longest standing ovations of Tupac's career. After the show, which lasted nearly 3 hours, Tupac found Bill backstage again. The older man was still overwhelmed by what he'd experienced, but there was something different about him now, a light in his eyes that hadn't been there before. I felt him tonight, Bill whispered, his voice filled with wonder. During the music, especially during Dear Mama, I felt Marcus with me for the first time since he died. I could feel his spirit in that arena. He was there, Tupac said simply. He's always been there, you just needed someone to help you see it. Tupac spent another hour with Bill after the show, listening to more stories about Marcus, his dreams, his plans, his love of rebuilding cars, and reading philosophy. They talked about Vietnam and Desert Storm, about the sacrifices soldiers make. Before leaving, Tupac made Bill a promise he would keep. I'm going to write something for Marcus. A song about soldiers, about fathers, about the strength it takes to survive losing everything. That song became Life Goes On, though the connection to Bill and Marcus was never publicly revealed. Those who knew could hear it in every line, the pain of loss, the strength to continue, the way love transcends death. Bill Jenkins continued working at the United Center for 10 more years, but everything changed after that night. He carried himself with new pride and began sharing Marcus's story again. When Tupac was killed later that year, Bill mourned not just a great artist, but a young man who had reminded him that his pain mattered, his story mattered, and his son's sacrifice would never be forgotten. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that every person has a story worth hearing.